the question people always are intrigued by and ask is, what's the relationship between all these converging ideas and political and commitments in the work? And the simple answer is that they are not, in principle, separate, in my mind. You know, the reasons why I got involved in moving image culture wasn't to make, like, Gone with the Wind. You know, it was as part of an ongoing set of engagements with matters, political, cultural, and of course, national, should we say. And the second thing that I think is important to say is that a lot of that stuff emerges, a lot of the work for me emerged out of an engagement with a set of people. You know, so if you're part of a collective and you've got a range of people from different backgrounds, different classes, ethnicities, they come with their own political, cultural agendas. And so the work becomes a kind of distillation of these competing, converging forces. So, yes, I would be, for instance, interested in liberation theory, in Fanonan ideas. We've got women who are raising questions about gender identity and questions of power. You've got, you know, literary figures interested in Derrida and Roland Barthes who are saying, well, actually, we need to deal with the question of authorship. You've got political fellow travelers who are saying, well, actually, the question of race and class needs to be thought through, and et cetera, et cetera. You know, so these are questions that emerge out of both a personal engagement with a range of people who are part of this collective that you're part of, but also in the attempt to make the work. Because the work is trying to say something about difference. It's trying to say something about political power. It's trying to say something about marginality and exclusion. And these things are not just filmic. They are epistemic, they are cultural, and they're political. So it's a complicated question, but in a way what I'm saying is that some of it's forced on you by the nature of the associations you make, and some of it is, some of it comes or arises out of a desire to make a difference in your practice. My piece is called Transfigured Night because it's about taking my cue from two bits of art, which are both called Transfigured Night, that are very important to me, right? The most important is the poem from the 19th century, German poet called Transfigured Night, or Verklagte Nacht, in which a couple go for a walk on a moonlit night, and the woman says to her new lover, you know, I'm carrying somebody else's child, but I love you, you know? And the man says to the woman, that's okay, you know? On this night, on this moonlit night, our love will transfigure this union. We will become whole because of this love. Well, that pretty much sums up for me the relationship between the post-colonial state and its citizen. It's about an ethic of promise. And the poem talks about it in a way that I think is suggestive. So one uses that. Now, I don't know many political theorists who would turn to a 19th century poem to talk about the post-colonial. But that's one of the ways in which I think artists are useful because, excuse me, they are able to render intelligible unspokens that lie sometimes at the heart of things, that from another vantage point suddenly becomes more intelligible, you know, more legible. I don't want to claim too much credit for Black Audio for some of these innovations, because I think generationally there was a whole group of artists and activists and intellectuals who emerge in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, in England in particular, at least the ones that I know. And we were concerned about the question of how the hyphen comes into being, yeah? How you become Black British or, you know, Asian English, or, you know, because these were impossible categories and identities until we begin to emerge as a distinct generation in the early 80s, late 70s. And because of the engagement with this key question of exclusion, you found yourself wandering necessarily into the spaces of the cultural, the political, the epistemic, because the question of who you are is not just an aesthetic question, but it's certainly almost not wholly a political question. So the distinction that you find in left circles before we came along, this interminable debate about relationship between aesthetics and politics, well, actually for some identities, these are bound up. And so the real question is, do you deal with them explicitly, or do you ignore them? If you call yourself an artist, then you're saying there are all sorts of strategies of naming that you want to hold off because you want to be considered as any other person. When you call yourself a Black artist, you are placing at the foreground all of those questions, which are supposed to be non-aesthetic questions. But for us, who called ourselves Black artists, this was the only way to do it, because actually the realization was that unless you did that, you were going to disappear anyway. You know, so for instance, somebody would say to us, well, if you just want to be artists, they're good ones. And you're not very good ones, because if you were, we would know about you, okay? So if you just want to be an artist, then, you know, sit down, wait your turn. When we've dealt with Picasso and Matisse and Braque, David Hockney, we'll come to you. If you say you're a Black artist, then you're also immediately writing a Refusnik manifesto, through which or with which you say, no, I won't wait, because my time is now. Because this narrative which says, you know, at some point you will recognize me, is a fiction. Because if it was true, there would be no need for me to say this, you know. So the very act of naming yourself in this way presupposes a conjunction, you know, a mix of questions which are aesthetic because you want to be an artist, and political because you want to be known principally as an artist of color. This is completely bound up. You can't separate it if you name yourself in that way. Yeah. So it's just in these ways that the question of identity throws up new relations between the aesthetic and the political for me. One of the films, artist films that I loved, I think we all did actually, was made by Isaac Julian in the very early 80s. It's called Territories. And in Territories, he has this incantation which goes throughout the film. And it's usually a mix of different voices saying, we are trying to tell a history, her story, a story specific to Black people. And this is just said again and again until it becomes like a song, a hymn, you know. Now, the question you're asking makes sense in this way. When you intensely engage with the issues that you think legitimize your identity, then it becomes almost an ethical imperative to come up with a way of making that identity speak. And if it speaks in ways that are already circumscribed by certain logics and genres, then you disappear. So what one is negotiating is about trying to move from darkness to light, quite literally, from the margins of stage to the center stage. So I make something, people hate it. You know, they say, this is the worst experimental gibberish. And I say, yeah, but it's my gibberish. You know, it's like, it's my shit. Because I would rather do that and for you to know that I'm making an effort to say something than to mimic what you see as the accepted language for constructing stories. You know, the desire for experimentation is tied to a need for emergence. It's not the other way around. You know, you don't emerge and then you say, oh, well, let me tell an experimental story. You try and tell experimental, quote-unquote, stories because you are trying to find a way of naming, of introducing yourself. That's the relationship to me. What other way can one speak about the short century? Which doesn't replicate old narratives, which doesn't revisit terrains that we all feel we've covered already. How else can we come at this question of the post-colony or Bandung or the post-war? I mean, all these categories which suggest that at some point there was some sort of break. Now, the question of how that break is marked differs group to group, people to people, but essentially we all accept that there was some epistemic, theoretical, political rupture which took place after the war. And it took place at the same time as all manner of actors and identities begin to occupy a stage. What can we say about that moment now? And how can we say that without replicating, as I said, cliche or stereotype? That was the challenge. And it's the challenge that made it exciting, because the minute you take on board a challenge, you're also taking on board new forms of associations, new patterns of affinity. You know, I mean, I've known Anselm for, I don't know how long now, a while. Same with Annett, same with the Otolith group. I don't think we've ever worked together as a, you know. So accepting the challenge to revisit this question is about trying to find another way of realigning those relations. And that's important for me. It's not just about making work, it's about forming new relations or producing new relations, because that's also part of the work. One of the key figures in both my formation and my generations, his name is Stuart Hall. He's a culture theorist and a public intellectual. And in his work, we found a lot that legitimized who we were and became. So this is really about returning that compliment. But in a kind of general sense, the Unfinished Conversation is about a very specific idea that Stuart Hall has really been peddling for a long time, which is that identities emerge at the intersection between the interior psychic space and the exterior historical. Identities emerge when those two things come together, not because of one or the other. And the idea was really to see how much of that thesis applies to his own life and work. And it's 3-screened. It's 40-something minutes long. I happen to like it, not just because I made it. And I hope it has a great time here. I mean, the non-alignment is one of the other reasons why it was important to do this. Because the term, for some reason, became fashionably seen as, I don't know, a bad term. You know, I was here, in fact, at a conference about 6 years ago, and somebody was just talking about non-alignment as if it was some dreadful mistake that we should have all grown out of. And that historical amnesia, that willful forgetting, really about the question of agency, yeah? new machineries of design which came in this rapture, through which all kinds of people tried to find ways of associating both with each other and the wider world, is fucking important. Still, to me.